Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you as always. Today is a payroll takeover. I've decided to get the whole of the payroll team together to have a little chat and to find out a little bit background about some of the guys, what they work on, some of the challenges they face. Because at Lace Partners, one of the key areas that we look into is around supporting payroll teams with whether it's looking at the payroll operating model, whether it's looking at future strategy, whether it's looking at the technology side, processes. We get involved in all of that sort of stuff for payroll teams. So I thought it's important to spend a bit of time reflecting on some of the challenges that we come across as a business, some of the challenges that my guests today have come across in their careers, but also to look forward into what the future holds for payroll functions. Some of the opportunities might exist for payroll teams, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 18 months onwards. Now, as is tradition on this podcast, I'm going to introduce all the guests first before we get on to our fundamentally different question. If this is the first time that you're listening, the fundamentally different question is a question that we ask every single week, and it is not related to HR or, in this instance, payroll, although there's a nuance towards today's fundamentally different question, which I will get to in a minute. But let's do a brief intro. I've got Adrian Axtell. How are you doing, Adrian? You all right?
Yes, I'm good. Thanks, Chris.
Not your first time on the pod, because we've done some stuff around national minimum wage before. So you're an experienced pro. Tricia Conway, I think this is your first time, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes. Hello, Chris.
And we're going to go nice and easy on you today, shall we?
Thanks. Yes, please.
We've got Chris Kirby, who is a veteran of the podcast. How you doing, mate? You all right?
I'm good, thanks. I'm certainly more grey since I joined Lace doing these podcasts than I was when I joined.
That is no slight on me, I hope. No slight. Simon Puryer, who has appeared on plenty of podcasts as well. You all right, Si?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, Chris.
And finally, it is another payroll debutant. It is Simon Bunday. Simon, how you doing? You all right?
I'm very well, thank you, Chris.
Now, I'm going to get you guys to give me a little bit of background if there's people that don't know a little bit about yourselves as individuals. But before I do that, we're going to start with our fundamentally different question. I'm going to start with Simon Bunday here. We're talking about payroll as a career, as a profession. We've done a really good podcast, which we released a few weeks back with Nick Day about how do you build the perfect payroller. For the purposes of my completely random question, I'm going to ask you, Simon, and then go to the rest of the group. If you were not allowed to work in payroll and you were allowed to go back in time, you were allowed to get into the Back to the Future style DeLorean and pick a career of choice, what did you want to be when you were growing up?
I had a sporting background and probably would have loved to have gone down that route. The downside I had is my age, in the fact that I chose a sport that went professional, and I was in that sort of too young, too old camp. I didn't make it as I wanted to, but my dream was to become some sort of sportsman. That's where I wanted to be, not quite making it, and therefore went in sort of the junior ranks.
I mean, you could have certain sports, curling, for example. I don't think there's too much of an age limit on there, but let's move swiftly on to Simon Puryer. Simon, what's your career of choice?
So my career of choice would have been to be a Blue Peter presenter.
I can believe that.
I always wanted to be a TV presenter, and I always wanted to be a Blue Peter presenter, especially. So there we go.
Probably also that speaks to a little bit of the power trip within you, that you'd be the one that gets to dish out the Blue Peter badges. We'll move swiftly on from that to Chris Kirby.
As much as I want to say I wanted to be a professional curling player and that you've just offended me, it was actually golf when I was younger. I would certainly go back in time and make a different decision when I got to a certain standard of golf and maybe flying around the world right now.
Yes, certainly there's enough money in that as well. Tricia?
I do remember when I was at school, I always wanted to be a social worker for some reason. I don't know why. It was obviously just a job that I'd heard about or something. My parents must have known somebody or something like that. But I think I'd have probably gone into event planning or something like that.
Well, we run lots of events at Lace, so maybe I can.
You might not want to admit to that.
I think I run everything. Life is on Excel, which is probably why I ended up in payroll. So there is a link.
And Adrian, just to wrap us up today, actually, let's go back around the houses just to get a little bit of background on each of you. So, Adrian, tell us your career of choice, and then for our lovely listeners, just give us a minute on your background, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. My career of choice. So I'm going to go back into my school days as well, which my career of choice at that point was to be a train driver. And the reason it was, I used to walk to school with my mum nearly every morning. We'd go across a railway line, and quite often the gates would be shut and there'd be a steam train come through, and it would just fascinate me, absolutely fascinated me. All went off the boil because then electricity started coming in and it started to be electric trains, and I just lost interest then. It was the steam and the smoke and all the rest of it that really excited me.
And then you decided a career in payroll. So talk to us a little bit about your background. Give us a minute on that, and then I'll go to Trish next.
My career didn't start in payroll. I actually started in finance. So I'm actually going back. I'm a qualified accountant from many years ago, and was in the retail sector for an awful long time and had a whole host of different roles, from being a buyer, import manager. So I've got quite an eclectic mix of different things I did through my career. About 13 years ago, I got involved in a payroll project, supporting a change within a retail business that we were working with at the time, helping them with their implementation. And it's just really grown from there. So I, like many people, I think I've just fallen into payroll and got fascinated with it. So yeah, it's not a full career in payroll, but that background of understanding businesses from a wider context helps me to put payroll into a position where I can understand what's going on, whether it be with finance or operational parts of business and so on.
And Tricia, did you fall into payroll, as Adrian said he did?
Kind of, yeah, it certainly wasn't planned. My now in-laws had an accounting firm, including doing small payrolls for customers. And they also liked to go on holiday quite a lot. So they needed somebody to cover the payrolls when they were going away. They asked if I would do that. I'd just not long since finished uni. That's how it started, because I was covering their payrolls for them. I think I was supposed to do the accounting bit as well, but I did not like that. And without giving my age away, how it worked was people faxed their hours that I would then input into the PC. I'd have to ring them because the fax would be smudged to confirm the hours, and that's how it worked. So yeah, that was my introduction into payroll, and obviously never left it.
Lovely. Can you just do maybe just a 30 seconds or so on roles that you've had since then and in recent years before you joined Lace?
I left there after just a year or two, and I went to a payroll provider. So it was Centrefile back in the day, that then became Ceridian, that's now Dayforce. So yes, I joined them. I like to refer to it as payroll boot camp, not in a negative way. It was very much getting into the world of payroll. Started my qualifications with those guys. And since then, I've had several years in the railway industry, some retail as operational, payroll manager and such like, and then moved on to more transformation and compliance roles, and then into consultancy.
Love it. And another person who's also rocked up at Lace with from an in-house side or an operational side, Mr. Kirby. Tell us a little bit about your background, because there'll be people that obviously will have heard you before in your dulcet tones, but just for those who maybe haven't, obviously you've done some work in financial services, but tell us a little bit more about yours.
I certainly did. I fell into payroll as well. I actually started in accounts payable, which I'm often surprised at how many people in payroll I speak to who did the same. But due to a takeover or two, I ended up as part of logistical movements of a business. I worked sort of ground up. I did administrative and senior administrative roles for maybe a decade, working at the AA and British Gas. Fantastic experience working with disconnected workers and all manner of different payroll weird and wonderful scenarios. And then I moved to Barclays, where I did a lot around transformation in the UK, Africa and the US, and a lot of global transformation. and ultimately became their global head of payroll. And I kind of lent towards that transformation experience. That was where my heart was lying. So I've been doing transformation for the last maybe decade, doing all sorts of implementations of systems, operating model changes, centralizations and regionalizations. And so, yeah, and I've been at Lace for about, I think it's nearly 4 years now, carrying on that transformation journey.
Now I'm going to go to Simon Bunday next. Simon, you've obviously also got that operational background. So can you tell our wonderful listeners a little bit around your sort of background and whether you also fell into payroll?
I have a teaching degree, but I've never used it to be a teacher, but used the degree, I suppose, to sort of start with as a trainer, and used to train people on software that led into payroll software. And then I took a role with a consortium of Oracle, IBM and McKesson, where we were sort of implementing the Oracle system to put into the NHS. So that was a huge project, which was sort of 4 or 5 years, where I was involved with the pilots, where we earned our battle scars, I suppose, in terms of what worked and what didn't work, implemented it, and then kind of moved out of that implementation type role to be operational. A number of years running the shared services, doing in-house payroll for our own trust, but also for a number of other trusts, really learning the operational delivery and how to make that successful. I suppose that led on to another role, both operational for in-house, and that was in the transport sector, doing exactly the same things, putting together buses and trains, multiple terms and conditions, very complex time and attendance rules around that. Using that operational experience, I led me back around to sort of consultancy, went and worked for Deloitte within their sort of payroll and workforce practice to take the knowledge, the battle scars I've earned, and use that to drive advisory to help clients with their successful delivery.
Love it. And last but not least, this time the other Simon, Mr. Puryer, if you can give our listeners a wonderful synopsis of you. My first question, kind of for a couple of you, it'd be interesting to get an operational versus a consultancy viewpoint on this, is around some of the biggest challenges you've faced when you're working with clients. Simon Puryer, if you can tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, and then think about one of the biggest challenge questions that we get asked from Lace, or you've been asked even prior to Lace when working with clients.
Okay, so a little bit about myself. My background is actually retail. I worked for WH Smiths for many years, doing all different types of roles, from store management through to head office roles, and then went into consulting to consult around retail operations, but then did fall into payroll because I was working with the retailer Argos, where they were embarking on a payroll project, and asked if I could help them. And I naively said, of course, how hard can it be? And I quickly realized just how hard payroll is, supporting them on their payroll journey for about 4 years. But then actually that led to me then being introduced into different clients to kind of support them on similar journeys. So I've worked with the likes of DHL, Marks & Spencer's, Sainsbury's, Moody's Financial Services, lots of different organisations on a global and a UK basis. I describe it as bridging the gap between the client, the provider, thinking about the broader impact that a payroll change has within the business. That's a bit about my background. That plays quite nicely into some of the challenges we see, because the challenge with payroll is people don't understand the complexity that surrounds payroll unless they are working within it. I often describe it as the kind of wheels on the bus, that whilst they're going round and round, no one really wants to worry about it. And then if you get a puncture or a wheel falls off, then all of a sudden there's a real problem. Therefore, I think the challenges we often find is, well, there's endless challenges I suppose I could reference, but a couple I'd call out would be people not perhaps thinking around the impact that a payroll change has on the broader business, because they perhaps think of it very much in isolation and don't think about the kind of broader impact it has more widely. And then I think kind of along with that people often think of it perhaps very much just as a system, so they can almost just strip out one system, put in a new system, and it'll all be fine. Whereas the reality is that bad data in, bad data out, just changing the system isn't going to change the way payroll operates within an organisation. So those would be a couple of the challenges we find.
Actually, I want to turn this into, I mean, we can't name names, Adrian, of businesses that we've worked with, or even prior to Lace businesses that we've worked with. But can you hold in your mind's eye a specific project that we've worked on, and then perhaps bring it to life as an example of, this was the problem that company X had, and so we solved it by doing thing Y? Is there anything that kind of pops into your mind, or is there anything that's been a common occurrence that you could just call out just for people listening in?
Yeah, I'll do it. First of all, Chris, I think in terms of clients, quite often their payroll is so all-encompassing in terms of their time and effort for them and their team that having the space to work out where they need to get to, how to improve the current operation is just not, there's not the capacity to be able to do that, which is often why they need help and support. Those things, coming back a little bit to Simon's point around operating model, one of the key things I see and am seeing currently with the clients I'm working with is that understanding of how much payroll is reliant on other functions within the business to deliver data and information efficiently, effectively and accurately. It doesn't really matter what your operating model is is it in-house, is it outsourced? If you can't grab the data and get the data from other parts of the business, because payroll is entirely reliant on information coming from other parts to be able to deliver. If you can't get that done efficiently, effectively and accurately, payroll is always going to struggle to some extent. And it's amazing how still that's a lack of understanding that exists within organisations as to how important the operations in functions outside of payroll and the way they do things is very important to payroll being effective and efficient. And I think payroll itself struggles a bit with not having that capacity to be able to, if you like, manage the other functions within the business to say, can you help me? Because I need you to help me by doing this and that, etc. Yep.
It's like being able to remove those silos and work in those cross-functional groups. Tricia, I think you've got something you want to build on that.
Yeah, it's just what Adrian's describing. What then happens for clients that I've worked with is that they come to you with what they think is an already solution, in that they want a different vendor. They say, the solution doesn't work properly, and then that's not necessarily the case. So it's that time to sort of stop and assess, and it might be an optimization project or it might be new vendor selection. So I think it's just the differences between the two, and hopefully we help to provide that moment to stop and clarify what the need is, because I think it's easy to be living in that situation and sort of blame technology, and then it's difficult to get investment, as Chris mentioned earlier. So yeah, just the difference between the two.
Simon?
To add on to the point that Adrian made in the sort of siloed working, if I think back to some of my operational days, and I was guilty of this, it's quite easy to have a green dashboard, nice KPIs of the accuracy of how well your payroll's doing, and the senior stakeholders can see that. But what you're not seeing is the month-by-month firefighting to keep the engine running, to keep the wheels on the bus. In Simon's analogy, I suppose, as I say, I was guilty of it, and what I mean by that is, rather than work to the root cause of the problem or where that data was becoming a problem, we'd kind of build mitigation within our own sort of checks and validation within payroll, because I had the control. I had the ability to control that. And I mean, it ended up being sort of a checklist that just kept expanding. And that's just not sustainable. So eventually something does break. And that's where we see these challenges. I suppose it's being able to take that step back, because you're so involved with the day-to-day. And that's where we do support, right? Where we can go in and allow teams to take that step back and work with others to identify the pain points, the challenges, to get to the cause and the root problem.
I'm going to bring Chris Kirby in on this now, because you've written a piece a while ago where you talked about looking at the symptoms rather than the cause. I want you to also put your operational hat on for previous pre-LACE life. Can you talk a little bit or build on some of Simon's point, particularly some of the issues that you've seen with regards to organizations and payroll teams not looking at the cause? Any thoughts on that? And then the second question, I guess, really is around picking a scenario in your head when you were previously operational, a challenge that you quite frequently come across.
Back to Simon's point around the symptoms, not the cause, and as you say, it's one of my favourite drums to beat. I think what Simon was articulating, I often refer to as operationalized workarounds. From a payroll perspective, if I think back to my operational days, be that in a smallish UK team or a global environment with hundreds of thousands of people or whatever end of the scale, one of the biggest challenges was the way that change was delivered and embedded, or not embedded as the case may be. And I think what you recognize when you do take that step back, and what I was recognizing, and probably why I sort of shifted into transformation as a sort of second nature kind of thing, was actually the reason is because we've been trying to do the right things. What people are trying to fix and the solutions people are trying to put in place in theory should have been the right thing. But the way that it's been managed, the way that it's been implemented, the way that it's not been potentially embedded and the full picture sort of handled means that what we've ended up with is an entire global operation built on operationalized workarounds. They're things that really shouldn't be done. They're those checks that Simon's talking about that quickly get out of hand, change after change, and they become your team's full focus. People are just 100% firefighting, swimming at 100 miles an hour just to stay afloat. From that operational lens, the biggest challenge that I was faced with was around the way that change is joined together. It took me quite a long time. Was a payroll purist, someone who had been in payroll for a long time. It took me a while for me to get my head around it and understand and recognize that's what it was, that it was that sort of change management that's put around these changes that in theory aren't really addressing the cause of the symptoms that are trying to be fixed, but also don't make sure that the operating model implications factor, that teams actually know what they're doing. The service to the employees isn't going to be impacted because in the worst case scenario, it's here's solution A. We've got these 15 tick boxes that if we can tick them in 3 months' time, it means we've been successful. Those are ticked, we move on. Actually, those 15 boxes, if they don't factor employees, they don't factor the day-to-day job of the teams, the op model implications. Most importantly, there's no follow-up post that go live date is quickly where you get into that situation.
We've got a campaign coming up called Driving Business Transformation. One of the challenges that we were talking about in one of our prep meetings was you often get organizations that maybe will go through M&A activity and they'll have a whole load of legacy systems brought in together. And what's happened is that HR or payroll teams have effectively workarounds for each of these different systems, but you bring it all together and somebody says, right, well, let's just distill this all down into 1 or 2 pieces of tech and that will save us a whole bunch of money because we won't use as many systems and we won't need as many people, but they don't realize it's all of those people that have been working on those workarounds to make the whole system work. So it's not just as simple as one new tech piece and we need 25% less staff. I want to move on to the differences because I'm conscious we've only got a few more minutes left, but I want to move on to a couple more questions. So I'm going to start with Tricia and then I'm going to go to Simon for these 2 questions, Simon Bunday, and then we're going to look at future challenges we might see. My question to you, Tricia and Simon, so we'll start with Tricia and then I'll go to Simon, is around the differences in working on that operational side versus being on that consultancy side. Any things that you've noticed? Tricia?
I think it's a tricky one. I think because obviously every client is different, but you can only try and bring some of your experience and expertise from previous roles and previous clients. I think the difference is having an operational background, absolutely recognise that ability to be able to stop isn't there. It's continuous. We are able to do that. That's the difference. You get the lens where you are able to stand at one side of it and look in and go, oh gosh, I recognise lots of those pain points. We talk to clients and are able to joke with those about being able to have flashbacks and being through some of the things that they've been through. It's not that we necessarily know any more than the payroll professionals within the organisation. It's just that we have the time they don't have, so we can go in and assist that way. I'd say that's the difference. I think it's very much shared knowledge, just that we're not firefighting that's been described earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, Simon?
Yeah, probably just to expand on that, we've been in the trenches. We can talk the talk with a payroll professional, and therefore the sort of consultancy advisory that come with it is to challenge back. Why are we doing it that way? And it becomes a conversation more so than a conflicted sort of argument as to why something's happening. You build up these processes because it's been there 20 years and you don't know why. Perhaps because the person that's built that process right at the beginning is no longer within the business. So to have a fresh perspectives on it, to bring that challenge to it is healthy, and then leads hopefully to better solutions, better outcomes, and looking for getting rid of the workarounds that we've got in place.
Chris, Kirby, you've just got a build before I move on to my final question.
I just wanted to add a bit to that, and it's reflecting on what I was saying earlier around the challenges that I recall and was navigating within ops. I think one of the other challenges around change being executed poorly is the lack of appreciation for SME input. By that, I mean internal SME input. So if we're working with a client, having sort of, as in Simon's words, walk the walk, I think we have that recognition of this can't succeed without that input and without that SME, without that experience internally who genuinely knows how this works. We'll bring a ton of experience, of knowledge to the table. We'll challenge that and we'll bring them along the journey. But a company's culture, a company's ways of working and those relationships that they bring are imperative. So I think that's also a lens from a operational versus consulting background that we bring, is that, understanding the shoes they're walking in.
I'm going to do Adrian and Simon P just to kind of wrap us up with our final question, because we're just running out of time. It's really just to look forward. So you guys have reflected on challenges that you've faced in your careers, or your teams have faced, in terms of operational versus some of the consulting side, or things that we come across when we get asked questions from clients. Adrian, we're at the beginning of 2025 at the moment. What do you think the big issues are for payroll teams at the moment? And then is that going to evolve over time?
So, Chris, I think the challenges the payroll experience today are not hugely different to what they used to be. I think there are more opportunities going forward for payroll to deliver more effectively what they do. Going back to what I was saying right at the beginning, there's something around getting the basics right as to why they operate, looking at really understanding what's going on today and some of the challenges that exist, so that they can then create that space and time to be able to start looking more seriously at some of the opportunities out there with AI, greater automation, working more closely and collaboratively with the rest of the business, and really exploring the best operating models that would work for their businesses. So I think it's about finding ways to get rid of some of those mundane things that create problems week in, week out for payrolls, month in, month out, and find ways of getting over those to create that space to be able to move forward more effectively. Businesses generally won't look at payroll first when they make changes. Changes will be made to payroll. Business expand, M&As come in. Can payroll cope with a new organisation coming into or new part of the organisation growing, etc.? Those things will continue to happen. Payroll might be last on the list in terms of thinking about what are we going to do and how are we going to operate. So payroll need to lead the way in terms of being involved in those things and creating the space so they can support business growth and use their data and knowledge of the business, which is quite enormous because they pay everybody in the business and they know an awful lot about the business, but actually being able to use that expertise to support the businesses in whatever direction they want to go strategically.
Yeah, and Simon, what Adrian's talking about there is opportunities, isn't it? But what do you see in terms of opportunities for payroll function? You've got automations, payroll leading the way in operating model changes or business changes. We've talked about employee experience and the impact payroll can have. But from you personally, what do you think clients or businesses, payroll teams are going to be coming to us and saying, this is the problem I need to solve in the next 12, 18, 2 years?
For me, I think the opportunity is the opportunity for investment in payroll. I think we're seeing more clients are actually coming to us now because they are recognizing that because historically there probably hasn't been the investment in payroll that there should have been, they can't continue to operate as they are because they've probably stuck sticky tape, sticky plasters over cracks that they can't continue to operate like that. And especially as businesses are expanding, trying to become more efficient, more effective, often all roads lead to payroll. So they need to improve the ways of working and the ways of administrating payroll. Therefore, the real opportunity is to recognise with all the kind of, the systems, the technology or the advancements, actually to take a bit of a step back and look holistically at that payroll operation to say, both from a system infrastructure, but also an operating model perspective, what are the opportunities to operate more efficiently and effectively as a payroll function?
Thank you very much, Simon, and the whole team for helping me get a bit of an understanding on some of the challenges that payroll teams of the past face and potentially of the future. Adrian, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Tricia, great to have you.
Thanks, Chris.
Mr. Kirby, pleasure as always.
Yeah, thanks. Enjoyed it again, Chris.
And the two Simons, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, if you want to have a reach out and a chat with the guys about any of the challenges that they've talked about today, then you can find out a little bit more about how we can help on the payroll section of our website. So if you go to what we do and the services that we have, there's a payroll excellence page which you can access. You can also reach out to any of the guys on LinkedIn as well if you just search for them, or have a look at our Meet the Team page. From myself and the whole payroll team, thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.